Hey, welcome back to Reignited in our project Magnum PI. Now you've seen the thumbnail, you already know that we are going to do an altitude adjustment on this car. That is right, we are fixing what I consider to be the most egregious issue with all of these LX vehicles, and that is the absolutely horrible wheel gap. Even with 20-inch wheels on there, you have this gigantic wheel gap, especially in the front, and it's just not acceptable. So we want to get this thing down where it belongs properly. Now, in order to do that, MaxPeedingRods sent out this full set of coilovers for this vehicle. Very excited about that. Thank you so much to MaxPeedingRods for doing that. I do have a discount code available for you guys if you want to check out the link down below to see either these products here. They have a bunch of other stuff for the LX vehicles as well. I kind of want to give these things a shot and just see how they are first. Take a look at the quality of them, install them, drive them, and see what I really think of them. I'll give you guys a more in-depth review later on. Okay, we've got the whole kit here together. Now, one thing obviously that is kind of noticeable right off the bat is that the shock body itself, the color isn't even close to a match to the copper of the actual aluminum bits. I don't know if that's intentional or not. I'm assuming it's intentional, that they couldn't quite get them the same. But if you look at the top of these bodies here, they're certainly not going to match the rears. That's not that big of a deal. It's just if you care about that sort of thing. I personally don't much care about that sort of thing, but if you do, that's something to look out for. And also during shipping, the little plastic shock gaiters here took a little bit of a beating. I might be able to massage these back into shape. But for right now, clearly not an issue. It's going to be behind the wheel. You're never really going to see these things. I'm not concerned about that either. Now, one thing I do like is that these shock bodies here, the top of them, they have this little spherical bearing built into the top hat that allows it to pivot. Should make it pretty easy to install. Also, something to note on these setups here is that these are fully adjustable. So I do have these adjusters built in the top of them so I can basically lessen the dampening or increase the dampening. So I'm excited to give that a try because I've never had that option before. So I want to get these things in the car, get the ride height set where I want, go drive the thing and see what it actually feels like to have a set of coilovers on your car. Now, a quick note that these are not fully adjustable. They are one step shy of being fully adjustable. Of course, you can set your ride height and your preload on your springs. You can change the damping, but the one thing that you cannot do is camber. These are not the adjustable top hat plates for that. So just go in knowing that you don't have that camber adjustment. So we're going to start this process on the front suspension here. Now, normally when I do this sort of job, I like to tackle the hardest job first and then move to the easiest one later. Because if you start with the easy side, then you feel really confident and then you move to the hard stuff and you're like, oh man, you start to feel defeated and start to slow down. Whereas if you get the hard stuff done first, then you still have enough energy to do the easy stuff. Now in this case, quite honestly, I think the front suspension is going to be the easy part. I should be doing the rear first. I just don't really feel like it. I want to work on the front suspension first. So that's what we're going to be doing. Now, as you can see right here, look at this stock wheel gap. That is ridiculous. The first step is not to jack up your car. The very first step is to loosen your lug nuts before you jack up your car, unless you have some sort of impact tool, in which case it doesn't really matter. Let's talk about the things that we likely need to disconnect to get this thing out of here, to get the original strut assembly out of here. We're going to need to undo the upper control arm here, right at this knuckle bolt. We're also going to need to undo the sway bar end link back here. Likely we'll have to remove the tie rod here so that the knuckle can shift and move out of the way, kind of flop out of the way. And then of course we'll have to remove the 3 nuts from the top of the strut assembly here inside the engine bay. Now those strut tops are just covered by a little plastic cover. It just pops right off. There's nothing that holds them on. It's just tension. So take a little pry bar, screwdriver, whatever, pop those covers off and take those 3 nuts off the top there. All right, this is disgusting. There's a big giant spider egg sac right there. That's gross. I think the first thing that I'm going to do here is remove this upper control arm here. So I'm going to take this nut off right here. Now, once we do this, this ball joint is likely going to be stuck inside this spindle assembly right here. It's a tapered fit inside here. So all you have to do is give it a couple of smacks with a hammer right here at the face of it. That's why it actually has that flat spot right here. So you give it a couple of smacks, it should pop free and the whole strut assembly or knuckle assembly should flop outward, thus helping to give us more room to actually get our strut assembly out of here. Let's get started. Boom, got it. Boy, this thing really slips out of the way nicely. Look at that. We may not even have to remove our tie bar here. or tie rod end, but we will still have to actually remove the sway bar end link back here because it is actually connected to the strut assembly. Then there's just one lower bolt that holds the strut assembly in place, and then this whole thing should slip on out of there. This could be actually even easier than I expected for the front suspension. Everything's so much easier with impact tools. This hand tool stuff's not working for me. Here is the main problem with sway bar end links, is that as soon as you start to loosen the nut, the whole thing will start spinning inside the housing there. Now, sometimes if you're lucky, like I am in this case, he actually has aftermarket sway bar end links on here, and there are flat spots on the back side here where you can put a wrench in there and actually keep it from spinning as you're undoing the nut. Sometimes you're not so lucky and there are no flat spots back there. In that case, sometimes on the end of the stud itself, there's an opening there that an Allen key will fit into to hold it still while you unbolt it. And even still, there's some that don't have either of those functions. In that case, if you don't have impact tools, you're kind of out of luck because it will just keep on spinning on you. By the way, while I truly empathize what a lot of you go through in your home garages or shops or whatever, keep in mind that I did this myself for many years before I became a tech. So I already know the struggle is real. I don't need to keep doing it. Success! All right, now we're gonna undo those 3 nuts on the top side and this thing should slip right on out of here. All right, let's see if I can finagle this thing out of here without having to undo anything else. Oh yeah, that was easy. Look, I gotta tell you, that was one of the most simple extractions I've ever done. Now, if I wasn't filming, I probably would have had that thing out of there in under 15 minutes. So that's awesome. Let's hope the rear goes as smoothly. I kind of think there's gonna be a lot more involved with the rear end, but this front end, this is going to go very, very quickly. Now, what we want to do is we wanna go ahead and measure the overall height of this strut right here, and then kind of take down whatever number that we want to drop the front end by. In my case, I'm going to go big. It's going to be 3 inches in the front. So we're going to go ahead and drop this thing a full 3 inches. The preload is already set on the spring on these things. All you have to do is adjust the shock body itself. So the whole entire shock body just spins, and you can lengthen it or shorten it and then tighten down that lock collar when you're all done. Now, one thing you do want to do is go ahead and add some anti-seize to these aluminum threads right here, because these can gall up very, very easily. There's going to be all sorts of dust and dirt that's going to get in there. The anti-seize will help, probably not fix the problem completely. But that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to go ahead and measure out this strut. And just so you guys know, these struts were already aftermarket struts that say made in China. So we're replacing some made in China parts with some made in China parts. Okay, we've got our measurements figured out. Now this stock strut assembly right here is 27 inches long total overall. So drop that down 3 inches. This one needs to be 24 inches. So we've got that set. Again, we can always change this after the fact. This is just gonna be a baseline to see where we stand after dropping it that far. I think 3 inches is a pretty darn aggressive drop. I'm excited to see if it works out for us though, because that factory wheel gap is just atrocious. Now the nuts that come with these new coilover assemblies, I don't really love them because they're just your standard hardware store hardware, and the holes that the strut goes into are almost large enough to exceed the diameter of the flange here at the bottom, so I'm just not really excited about that. I'd rather use these factory hardware right here. You can see how much wider it is and it covers more surface area. It's the exact same thread pattern here. The coilovers do come with this new lower hardware for the bottom here of the coilover. Seems how the factory ones have a nut that's actually welded to the shock body itself. I might actually use a floor jack here to actually raise this thing up slowly, so that's very easy to get this thing put into place. So kind of before I move any further forward, now that I've got this thing back into place, I kind of want to at least throw the wheel in here and kind of see where the wheel gap stands before I actually even put any weight on the vehicle. If it's already stuffed up against the fender, clearly this ride height is not going to work. So I haven't tightened any of this hardware yet. I just kind of want to give it a shot first. All right, that actually doesn't look too bad. Once this thing actually settles down, I may have about an inch or so of wheel gap there, and I think that's pretty close to what I want. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and tighten this thing down, tighten everything down, I still don't know if it's going to be exactly the ride height we want, but I think this is a really great starting point. Look, I gotta say, out of everything I've shown you guys on my channel, that's gotta be top 3 of easiest things to do on a vehicle. I think level of mechanical knowledge required to do this job would be probably a level 1. I'm not kidding, it is that simple. Probably just a step above the headlight cleaning, which I wouldn't be doing again on this vehicle here. But that is just the front. I think we still have to do the rear there, and it's going to be a lot more difficult, a little bit more things involved to it. For right now, we're gonna go ahead and drop this thing down. I think there's a pretty fair chance I went too aggressive with this thing and we're probably too low right off the bat. But that's okay. That's okay. That's what we're here to do. We're here to find out. So let's go ahead and lower this thing down and see what it looks like. All right, we may be okay here. This isn't too bad. Of course, once I actually try to turn and everything, that might be a different story. She's definitely low though. And of course, we have to keep in mind that these will probably settle a little bit once we get some drive time on them. Just 2 other quick things I want to point out here on the front suspension as you're reassembling it. And the first thing is, with those sway bar end links on there, you'll want to have both of them disconnected at the same time, because if one's connected and the other one is not, it makes it, the sway bar itself has tension on it. It would make it very hard to get the one sway bar end link back in there. So don't actually tighten up those sway bar end links until after you've got the new coilovers in both sides. That way the sizes actually match up and they'll go in together. So that won't be a problem. The second tip is when you're reinstalling your upper control arm, that stud, that ball joint stud, is going to spin on you as you're trying to tighten the nut. Now inside the stud on the bottom is actually fitted for a 6mm Allen. So you just take a little 1/4 drive Allen like this, stick it in there, and then you're able to tighten your wrench and tighten that bolt down. So you guys know how important lighting is to me. I'm always talking about lighting. I want more lighting. I want better lighting. It needs to be brighter in here. In fact, you guys will see very shortly that I'll be doing a shop upgrade on the lighting in here because it's just too dark for me. I think it's in fact the most underrated tool in a mechanic's arsenal is proper lighting. It changes things that much. With that being said, I had a company reach out to me, this Odelphi company here, and they had these new headlamp style lights, and that's not really something I've ever been interested in before. But there was a couple of things about this one that interested me particularly. Let me tell you about them. Now the first thing is because I don't really like a big bulky light sitting right on my forehead right here. In this case, it is just a LED strip light that goes along the front. Now there's not only that light, but there's also a beam light here on the side to give you a more focused beam. But I like the broad beam myself to give you as much light. Now being LED, this thing puts out a terrific amount of light. That is probably my favorite feature about it, is how much light it puts out. Now the feature that actually was unique on this that really made me interested in it is that it has a wave on and off feature. So as you're wearing it, you can wave your hand by the sensor and it'll either turn it on or you can wave it again and turn it off. Why does this matter? Well, as a mechanic, my hands are constantly dirty or oily. And even when you're wearing gloves, I don't really want to transfer that to my head by reaching up and touching something. Trying to turn a button on and off can be really tricky. For the last 3 weeks, I've been testing them both here at the shop and at my work. Now, it seems to me that there's only a couple of things that are really holding this light back from being really, really good. Now, the first of those is that they actually sent me 2 of these, like I said, and one of those is at work, one of those is here in the shop. Now, it is sub-freezing here most nights, and I don't know if that had something to do with it, but already on this one, on the inside, the adhesive is failing that is holding the strip light to the back of the strap here. So that's something that I don't think should happen. Obviously, I think there should be some improved adhesive that's being used, or maybe it was just the cold temperatures that caused that. I'm not really sure. All right, let's get into the one thing I think is really holding this thing back from being an absolute game changer, and that is the wave function that we talked about before. Now, does it work? Absolutely it works. The problem is it works a little bit too well. The sensor is just too sensitive. Now, what I mean by that is if you're actually using this thing, like say in a fender well or something like that, and you turn your head, it will sense the motion of the fender well on the side and turn the light off as though you waved your hand at it. So then you gotta wave your hand to turn it back on again, then you turn your head and it turns back off again. So it's just too sensitive. I think if there's a way at the factory for them to desensitize that wave sensor just a little bit to where it only senses your hand passing back and forth across it, That is what's really going to change this thing into something that I think would be absolutely fantastic. And at $30 for one of these things, it's not very expensive. I think it's a pretty decent option. And if you guys want to check them out, I'll go ahead and include that link down below in the description. Now we're going to start in on our rear suspension. Essentially, we are just replacing the stock shock assembly here with this one that does have an adjustable shock body on it. So you can actually shorten this or lengthen it. And then behind the shock body is where the spring actually mounts. Now to do this, we're going to have to lower the entire rear subframe down enough to get these stock springs out of the way. So it's definitely going to be a little bit more complex than the front suspension. I'm interested to give it a try. I have not actually done this way before. So I'm interested to see just how much work is involved. So let's get into it. I think the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and unbolt the shock assembly. There's just 2 bolts here that bolt straight up into the body. Not a big deal. And then there's 1 bolt along the bottom edge down here. And it looks like we're going to be reusing all of the factory hardware to put it right back into place. Now, in order to let this rear subframe down evenly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and unbolt the shock from the opposite side as well. That way everything can come down nice and level. Now that our shock's loose on both sides, we're going to start lowering this rear subframe here. Now there's just 4 bolts that hold it. That's what I like about these setups. There's modular subframes. All of these linkages and things are held in by 1 sub-assembly that is only held to the body with 4 bolts. Now what we're doing here is we're not going to zing these bolts out of here because then the whole thing could come down on us. What we're going to do is we're going to slowly loosen the rear subframe, try to get it to drop down as much as possible, see if maybe we can get these springs out without having to fully drop the subframe. Now at this same time as we're loosening that rear subframe, we also want to support the bottom of it with a floor jack, just in case you end up going a little bit too far and undoing the bolt all the way. You don't want this thing shifting around or dropping on you. So we're going to support that with the floor jack, start loosening up these bolts, see just how far we can drop this thing down. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't look like loosening it was going to be far enough to get this thing loose. We're going to have to actually drop the subframe itself down. So I went ahead and took all 4 bolts out. The rear ones are going to be a lot longer than the front ones, so just remember where they go. Now we got that floor jack under there. We're going to slowly lower the floor jack, and that'll allow us the room to actually take these shock mounts out and then also get our springs out of the place. And then we'll take a look at reinstalling the new parts. Now the key here is we only want to go just far enough to be able to get these springs out of here. We don't want to drop the subframe all the way down out of there. For one, you're going to run into your exhaust here at some point, but we just want to give it just enough room to get these things out of there and then slip it back into place. Because the less we can move this thing around, the easier it's going to be to actually get these holes to line back up for our subframe when we put it back into place. All right, got the shocks out of there. The springs look like they're very close to coming out. Let's see if we can slip them out of there. Oh yeah, very good. All right, perfect. Now you can see just how much of a difference there is in spring size between this new kit and the old. This doesn't mean that this is the amount of drop you're going to get because it comes with this adjustable collar here where you can then adjust how much actual drop you're going to get out of this thing. Here you can see with the 2 springs side by side that they're overall pretty close to the same height as they would be stock. So this is where you're getting your drop from, is with this little collar right here. So I think in our case, I want to do an 1.5 inch drop here in the back. Definitely not nearly as aggressive as the front. The front was just ridiculous. So we'll try to do an 1.5 inch drop here in the back. I'm kind of guessing at this point to see overall what height we want with this thing, because I don't know if this spring rate's identical to this one or not. I don't know, I'm guessing. We're gonna find out. But again, all this stuff is adjustable after the fact if you do wanna change it. So let's go ahead and get this new spring in here. Let's get this height set and again, try to match it side to side. Let's get these things slapped back in. I gotta say, it looks like this rear install is going to be just as easy as the front was, if not even simpler. Now it does look like in order to install this little adjustable collar right here into our lower spring perch that we have to remove the factory rubber grommet that goes into that lower control arm. So I'm pretty sure it's just pressed into place with a couple of rubber pins. Let's go ahead and grab hold of this thing, kind of just pry it out of there, and we should be able to install our collar with no problem. There we go. All right, I've got my collar about where I want it to be. I'm gonna go ahead and try to lock these down just a little bit. We can do so more when it's actually firmly installed, but I just wanna get them fairly tight before we actually put them in there. Now, just as you adjusted the spring base, you also need to adjust your shock body to make sure it's going to correctly match up here. As you can see, this one is far too short to actually work right now. We're gonna have to spin this thing out. Again, you wanna match that 1.5 inch drop that you have achieved with the spring perch there. Hopefully we can get that done very quickly here, get this thing locked in and get it set into place. Now, one of the trickier parts of this whole deal is to get this thing back into place with the springs in the correct position. Because if you look at the perch here where the spring goes up against, you can see where the spiral of the original spring went, and you want to match that. So the position of the end of the spring right here is actually very important for setting the ride height. So you want to match up to what it was originally, but that can be difficult as the subframe is lowered down. So you want to go ahead and raise the subframe up, slowly try to get it in the right position. You don't want to just jam the subframe up tight and just try to bolt it right on down. This is definitely one of those jobs where it is helpful to have an extra set of hands who can maybe guide the spring as you're raising the subframe back up, but it's not fully necessary either. All 4 subframe bolts bolted straight up, no wiggling of the subframe necessary. I cannot believe how simply this is going. I probably shouldn't be saying that out loud because now I'm going to ruin it, but to be honest, I just cannot believe how simple this whole process has been. Let's go ahead and get this subframe tightened up. We'll go ahead and get these shock bolts reinstalled. Then we're pretty much there. Now, in order to get these upper shock bolts reinstalled, we have about 1.5 inch gap here, so we're probably going to have to use a floor jack to actually go ahead and raise up this whole knuckle assembly to get those bolts in. But after that, this install is pretty much ready to go. Well, when you make a mistake, you just got to own up to it. Now, I actually just posted this video yesterday, but a viewer pointed out to me that when I installed these rear springs here, he said, hey, the adjustable perch actually goes on the top and the spring goes on the bottom. And you know what? He was absolutely correct. That was my fault. I did not clearly read the instructions on that. So we're going to go ahead and correct that now, get this flipped around, and then we'll continue on. Okay, about 20 minutes worth of work later, and we have our spring in here correctly. Now, the one thing that's different from what I mentioned before is that when you put this in, you don't want to remove the isolator from the A-arm itself. You want to remove the isolator from the body when you put this thing in. So now we have this thing all in here correctly. Like I said, mistakes happen, but you got to own up to them. Let's move on. Now again, this is likely going to settle a little bit more here in the back. Now you'll notice I didn't quite drop the rear as much as the front. I do like a little bit of rake to it, and I suspect there's going to be a little bit of movement here, so I wanted to leave this a little bit higher. It actually looks pretty decent. It's definitely higher in the back than the front, but that is by design. But I think we're pretty darn close. I gotta admit, I'm very surprised. I thought I would have to adjust this thing a couple of times to get it really where I want it. We'll just have to see where it settles. I might want to drop it just a little bit lower, but I think we're fairly close to where we want to be. So one thing to keep in mind about adjustable coilovers is that they are exactly that, adjustable. This means that they are not just an install and then you're done and you're finished with them. They take a little bit of time to really dial it into exactly what you're looking for. So you need to be prepared to actually jump in there multiple times to make those adjustments to really get the maximum out of them. Because if you just install them with a set of base settings that you think are close and then you drive it and you're like, it's all right. Well, it's on you if you're not actually adjusting them, because that is the entire point of adjustable coilovers. So that's what we're going to be doing on this car. I'm going to be driving it around, seeing what I think, making minor adjustments here and there. And I'll probably let you guys know in a future episode what sort of adjustments I ended up making to get it exactly where I wanted it to be. So there's one last step we have to do in this process, and that is make sure that you torque all your lug nuts properly once you let the vehicle down. It'd be really frustrating to do all of this work and then watch your wheel pass you as you're driving down the road. So make sure you torque those lug nuts properly. I think if you are properly prepared, you could do the entire job in 2 hours. Now, this is definitely something, even if you're not skilled with mechanical things, just during a Saturday afternoon, you could absolutely accomplish this job. It is that easy. I'm still blown away by just how simple it was. So it's hard to get more of a bang for your buck than putting a suspension system on your car. I think you guys can agree that this absolutely transformed the look of this vehicle, getting rid of that atrocious wheel gap on there. Special thank you to MaxPeedingRods for sending out this coilover set. Now, this is a great way to lower your LX vehicle. Like you guys saw, it was a very, very simple process of installation. Unfortunately, this does not work on the all-wheel drive cars, but I'll go ahead and post what it does work on below. Now, driving this thing around, I think the only thing I really want to change so far has been I want to add a little bit more preload to the spring. But other than that, it actually drives pretty nicely. I obviously haven't gotten into some very spirited driving just yet, but again, that's a great thing about a coilover system, is that it is fully adjustable. So as you determine there's a need, you can go in and start to adjust things. Now, as you guys can see from the video, this vehicle still really needs a lot of help, especially in the paint correction side of things. We got some work to do on this thing. However, I have some very, very exciting stuff coming up next. I hope you guys will stay with me for that. Until that time, we'll see you next time on Reignited.